how does the brain produce consciousness? And what experiments can neuroscientists do to help to answer that question? Welcome to Episode 2 of BookLab, the podcast where we check out what's new in the world of popular science books. I'm your host, science journalist Dan Falk.
And I'm your other host, science journalist Amanda Gefter.
In this episode, neuroscientist Stanislas Dehaene tackles the problem of consciousness. Each of us has a 3.5-pound lump of squishy gray matter inside our heads, and somehow it produces conscious experience. Professor Dehaene tells us how his own research is helping to explain how that happens. His new book is called Consciousness and the Brain.
And later, what do physicists know about the nature of time? And was a laboratory in New Jersey the birthplace of the modern computer? That's coming up in the second part of the show, where Dan and I talk about a couple of other science books you might have missed.
But first, consciousness and the brain.
Stanislas Dehaene is a cognitive neuroscientist and a professor of cognitive neuroimaging at the Collège de France in Paris. In his new book, he's giving us a very up-to-date, very current look at a problem that's been with us for centuries.
Yeah, this problem of how the brain produces consciousness is one that scientists and even philosophers have been grappling with for a long, long time. And since we're talking about people working on it in France, we can maybe mention the work of René Descartes, of course, the very influential philosopher working just at the very beginning of what we think of as modern science. And there's a quotation from Descartes that Dehaene actually gives us towards around the middle of his book, and I'll just read it. So this is from René Descartes. "But what then am I? A thing which thinks. What is a thing which thinks? It is a thing which doubts, understands, affirms, desires, wills, refuses, which also imagines and feels." So, that's 400 years ago, and people are still struggling with it today.
Well, Descartes was dealing very much with the question of interiority, right? Your subjective experience, what it means to think. But there was this sort of interesting period around the 1950s when behaviorism was sort of the rage in psychology. And the idea was, you don't talk about what's going on inside the brain. The brain's sort of like this black box, and you just have to look at external behavior, things that can be measured. And that was considered the only scientific way to do things. And so in the book, Dehaene tells us that, he was a student in the 1980s. And even then, it wasn't really acceptable to talk about consciousness. He refers to it as the C word at that time. And that all began to change in the late 80s. And in this book, Dehaene is going to tell us why that changed.
Yeah, exactly. It's a fairly bold and certainly ambitious book, and he has come up with what he believes is a scientific explanation, or at least the concrete beginnings of a scientific explanation of how consciousness works. And I think the general theme that we find throughout the book is that many of the things that the brain does, and of course the brain is very active and it is doing lots of things all of the time and processing all sorts of information, but most of those things unfold below the level of consciousness. And what happens is some information, the most important information, gets passed along to the conscious mind and is actually experienced. Now, this is a little bit tricky because it's not like there's someone in the master control room watching all of this. This would be the idea of the homunculus, the little man in the head. And of course, Dehaene knows better than to bring in a homunculus. But somehow the brain is sort of monitoring itself. There's a brain-wide information sharing process that's going on, and certain bits, the most important bits, come up to the surface and are experienced as consciousness, and he calls this the global neuronal workspace theory.
He compares it to the clipboard on your computer. So when you switch between applications, you can hang on to some, chunk of text or some bit of information on the clipboard. It serves as this temporary workspace. And the idea here is that consciousness is doing something similar, where it can, extend the lifespan of a thought or hold on to some sort of image from the external world, even once the external stimulus is gone, and it can synthesize and broadcast that information to the other unconscious parts of the brain. And what's great about this book is that Dehaene himself is a very active researcher, and he, in his lab has done experiments to show how all of this works.
Yeah, Dehaene has clearly been very busy, and he talks about not just 3 or 4 experiments, but really a lot, probably a dozen or more different experiments, most of which he's been personally involved in. And I'll just describe one of them briefly. I think of this as the penny versus pound experiment. So the subject is looking at a computer screen or a TV screen where images are being shown, but they're being shown very quickly. So, in fact, the participant isn't able to say what the picture is of. If you ask them, so the picture being shown is either of a 1 penny coin or a 1 pound coin. But if you ask the subject which one was it, they'll say, I don't know, I don't remember seeing a coin at all. But what's interesting is they're given sort of a lever to squeeze on, and how hard they squeeze can be monitored. Obviously, it's generating some sort of electric current or something. And they're told, you should, if you squeeze hard enough, you'll actually be rewarded the amount of money that was in the picture. So that's interesting. If you knew it was going to be a pound coin, you would squeeze a bit harder, right? Now, the thing is, they claim that they cannot even tell that there's a picture of a coin being shown, and yet, and this is the cool part, and yet they squeeze harder when they're being shown the picture of the pound coin. So it's kind of neat, and you can see perhaps where Dehaene is going with this. It's a part of his sort of arsenal of evidence that many kinds of things, many kinds of information processing are happening, and they're happening perfectly well, but they're happening below the level of consciousness. So that's...
He has this great quote from Julian Jaynes, the Princeton psychologist, where Jaynes says, consciousness is a much smaller part of our mental life than we are conscious of, because we cannot be conscious of what we are not conscious of.
I'd say you can say that again, but I bet you probably can't.
That one hurt my brain, but I loved it.
Yeah, so there is definitely this theme running through the whole book. And overall I found it kind of compelling, because there is, again, this kind of armada of experiments, all of them leading towards this general conclusion. It sort of bothers me a little bit that he switches back and forth between different analogies. So at one point he's comparing consciousness to a swarm of flies, but then a few pages later he's saying consciousness is like a sculpture, and then later in the book he'll be comparing it to something else. So, I found it a bit hard to keep track of some of these analogies. And
I have to say I loved the sculpture analogy. So if we had to keep one in, that would be the one. I mean, I thought, so his idea there was that, if you carve a sculpture from a block of marble, let's say, the final product is sort of defined as much by what you removed as by what remains. And so he talks about how silent neurons that don't fire, actually encode information. And you sort of never think about that, right? You think about particular neurons firing, and then that registers some bit of information. But he's basically saying, normally there's all kinds of noise. Your neurons are sort of firing randomly all over the place in your brain. And it's actually by silencing certain ones in order to leave, other ones active, that you define a thought. And so he has this description that by silencing neurons, you carve out the contours of thought. And I thought that was just a beautiful description. And what's really fascinating is this is actually measurable. You wouldn't think something like that would be measurable, but when the neurons are being inhibited, this actually creates a positive electrical potential in the brain that can be measured with EEG, so with these electrodes that can be placed on the scalp. And this silencing is known in neuroscience as a P3 wave. This is known to be a signature of consciousness. And so here he's explaining what's happening behind that the signature of consciousness is a kind of silence.
And that really is interesting, and this is obviously something that we couldn't have done, even just a few years ago. And just this brings us to the more general point that he mentions that this was not a popular line of inquiry. I forget how many years back, but in the 1980s. But now, especially sort of from the 1990s onwards, we've had these remarkable brain imaging techniques, including fMRI, most importantly, and also EEG, and they work a little bit differently and they measure slightly different things, but taken together, they really reveal quite a bit about what the brain is doing, and allegedly about what the conscious mind is doing or experiencing. And I think the only problem here, and this is something that, of course, critics are quick to point out, is that, well, take for example fMRI, it's measuring blood flow, right? That's what it's actually measuring. And so you can always say that, what we're interested isn't, we're not interested in blood flow per se. We're interested in the so-called qualia. We're interested in the actual thing, the subjective experience that the subject is undergoing. What are they feeling? So that's a tricky part. Of course, that's always been sort of a criticism or a concern in these kinds of investigations.
And the question is, can you ever measure something like that? And this becomes particularly interesting in light of the huge economic investment that's being made in these sort of brain mapping projects that were announced last year. So in the US, there's the Brain Initiative project, which aims to map every single neuron in the brain. It's like the neuroscience equivalent of the Human Genome Project, and the US is investing, I believe, like $300 million into this. And in Europe, there's a similar project called the Human Brain Project, which aims to simulate a human brain on a computer. And they're investing €1 billion into this project. And so, this raises the question of how much can these kinds of measurements tell us?
Yeah. Now, of course, that's still cheaper than the Large Hadron Collider, but yeah, I appreciate the point that a billion here and a billion there, and as the saying goes, eventually you're talking about real money. But yeah, so are these projects going to be fruitful? I mean, of course, I don't think either of us knows the answer to that question, but it is certainly a concern, and the people who look at there's a sort of a parallel quest. AI, right? Artificial intelligence. People are trying to figure out, how to create a conscious but and yet inanimate entity. So using non-biological matter, but still creating a thing. Again, going back to Descartes' phrase, a thing which thinks. Except this time, it won't be a biological person. It'll be something like a machine, some kind of computer. And of course, there are a lot of real issues with that, and one of them is that, of course, the brain itself, the human brain, the biological brain, wasn't really an engineering project in the sense that we might naively think of it. I mean, it is something that appeared very, very gradually in the evolutionary story of our species. So, we diverged from the chimpanzees 6 or 7 million years ago, and now we have a brain that's, I guess, about 4 times bigger than a chimpanzee brain, but much, much more complex. And if you want to take the story back even further, we can go back 4.5 billion years to the time when the first wiggly green and blue algae sort of appeared on our planet. So the human brain, in a certain sense, was not so much engineered, but kind of accidentally put together by this ongoing series of not exactly random, but a combination of random events and this selection process that, of course, Charles Darwin talked about 150 years ago. So, that's not like what they're trying to do with these billion-dollar computer projects.
And that raises the question of whether consciousness serves some sort of evolutionary purpose. Is it something that's selected for, or is it a sort of epiphenomenon, right? So the sort of classic example of this would be something like the sounds that your heart makes, right? So it's most likely that the sounds that your heart makes didn't serve a purpose. It's the mechanical function of your heart that was selected for, and the heart sounds just sort of come along with that. So there's a question of whether consciousness was actually selected for by evolution or whether the underlying brain processes were selected for and consciousness was sort of this bonus that got thrown in along with it. And Dehaene takes a hard line on this. He feels strongly that consciousness does serve an evolutionary purpose. And he gives a few examples of the purposes that it could serve. One is that it allows the brain to connect the past to the present to the future. That without consciousness, we would just sort of live in this eternal present that was constantly fleeting. And the brain is able to learn over time because of conscious processing.
There's been some very interesting work on this. I think Dehaene only perhaps alludes to it briefly, but there's been some very interesting work with other species, checking to see whether certain kinds of birds can remember the past and plan for the future. And it's very interesting. Of course, in other species, it's quite rudimentary, but human beings, we do this all the time, and you can instantly see how this gives you an evolutionary advantage, because we sort of know that, the mastodon is going to be coming down the canyon in the afternoon, right? I mean, he does it every day. So if we're there tomorrow with our spears and our dogs, we're going to have, some tasty dinner for the next month. So this business, and I think in the literature they call it mental time travel, imagining other moments in time. So I do actually find that part of Dehaene's argument to be quite compelling. But I'm still sort of wondering between that and the proposed mechanism that Dehaene is suggesting. This network of brain systems, this global neuronal workspace. I mean, have we actually explained consciousness? Because I think you can argue that there's still something left out, that we're still not quite tackling the subjective experience of what it feels like to be living from one moment to the next.
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I think here Dehaene is tackling what, the philosopher of mind David Chalmers would call the easy problems. And not because they're easy, but because they're ordinary. They're ordinary scientific problems. They require sort of imaginable biochemical functional explanations, whereas the hard problem, this problem of why should it feel like anything at all, this problem of subjectivity, it's almost hard to imagine what an answer could look like. And whatever it is, it's clear that just explaining, the physical mechanisms at work is not going to do it.
Right, so that's an argument that we sometimes hear, and I guess the philosopher Colin McGinn has been the most vocal in putting forward that case. But of course, there are a lot of contrasting and I think we can say conflicting opinions on how to solve the hard problem, or whether the hard problem can in fact be solved. And I mentioned Colin McGinn, but in contrast we have someone like Daniel Dennett, or for that matter Patricia Churchland, who have said that essentially solving the quote easy problems amounts to a solution of the hard problem. There isn't anything extra left over. We just think there is because we have an antiquated way of looking at this. But when we've solved all the easy problems, the hard problem will just kind of disappear, in much the same way that approximately 100 years ago, when people were talking about a life force, when they were trying to explain the biological world, the French would have talked about élan vital, but we don't talk about that way anymore. Not because there was some decisive moment when we solved it, but just that once we started to understand, the mechanism through which cells reproduce, and the structure of DNA, and issues of reproduction and development and biological evolution, we just stopped thinking in terms of a vital force. So the problem just kind of went away. So maybe the hard problem will go away.
There's certainly a number of people that think that. I find that so hard to stomach because, any argument where you're explaining sort of the mechanism of how all these things work in the brain, you're talking about objective phenomenon. But the question is, how do you explain subjective phenomena? And they're just these two separate categories, subjectivity and objectivity. And I just don't see logically how anything that you could say about objectivity is going to sort of bridge you into this other category. And so to my mind, just giving the mechanisms, I believe in this hard problem. But by that logic, you might say that maybe the hard problem is not actually a problem of neuroscience, because the job of neuroscience is to explain, these mechanisms in the brain. And so if that can't ever get to this question of subjectivity, then maybe the question is not a neuroscientific question. And I would argue that it's, a philosophical question, and it's actually a question of fundamental physics, because at bottom, it's a question of what kinds of things exist in the world, right? What kind of universe can support both objective and subjective phenomenon? So Chalmers has suggested that consciousness may be a fundamental ingredient in the world, so that in the same way that you have, particles and forces and these different ingredients that make up the physical world, that consciousness would be one of them. And if that's the case, then this is a question that's encroaching on physics. It's not a neuroscientific question. So maybe it's just asking too much of neuroscience to solve the hard problem.
Right, and our listeners are going to have their own opinions about this very deep question of how much or how little neuroscience can contribute to solving the problem of consciousness, and whether it is maybe best left for philosophy or for physics. I will just mention that the discussion that you and I are having now about the hard problem is actually quite a bit longer than the discussion that Dehaene gives us in the book, because the book is, I forget, around 350 pages maybe, but he doesn't start talking about the hard problem until 5 pages from the end of the book. And I'm just going to say, in my opinion, it's a bit late in the game to suddenly be reminding us that there are also philosophical problems. That's
Especially when the epigraph to the book is this great quote from Nabokov that says, "Consciousness is the only real thing in the world and the greatest mystery of all." So that's how he sets up the book, but then he, doesn't really get to the mystery till the very end, and then he dismisses it really quickly.
right. And I think, even looking at the title of the book, maybe the title is, I don't want to say false advertising, but maybe the title could have been slightly different. The title is Consciousness and the Brain, but perhaps it should have been Perception and the Brain. He's describing these experiments that he's done that illuminate sort of pathways of perception, and how certain things that we perceive are experienced by this larger system. But, does he tackle the problem of consciousness head on?
I think that really hits the nail on the head. And it brings us back to what we were saying in the beginning, because Dehaene talked about consciousness being a taboo word, and that that's changed in recent years. And the reason that he gives that it changed is that we now have a better definition of consciousness. But you might ask, is it really a better definition, or is it just a sort of watered down definition? So his new definition is what he calls conscious access. And I think it's exactly what you're saying. It's perception. It doesn't have to do with, subjective experience. And so he really is sort of interrogating this notion of perception. And yes, by changing the definition of consciousness, you make it more amenable to scientific study, but maybe you also just obscure the problem that we really cared about in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's definitely it's sort of how I felt when I read it, so I wouldn't be surprised if some other readers also have that experience in reading the book. Now, I will say, so I had a few concerns with the book. I'll mention one right now. He makes some bold predictions. At a certain point, he says that he wouldn't be surprised if we're decoding human thought within a few years, and I just don't think it's going to happen that quickly. I mean, if we get to that stage eventually, I think it'll be a remarkable achievement. I think it'll actually be kind of a frightening achievement in many ways, but I think that's still some time away. I want to add that some parts of the book I actually found very, very fascinating. He has a section on near-death experience, and sort of the distinction between a patient who's in a coma and a patient who's even worse off by being in a vegetative or minimally conscious state. Of course, listeners will remember the very tragic case of Terry Schiavo, who died in 2005, and of course there was a debate as to whether she was alive, whether there was any chance of her recovering or not recovering, and in the end, she was allowed to pass away. Now, an autopsy later showed that her brain was severely damaged, and essentially there had been no hope. But what's interesting is that Dehaene is arguing that there could really be medical payoffs here if there are experiments that we can do that will sort of directly measure the amount of consciousness, let's say, in a person's brain, rather than relying on sort of secondary characteristics like, blinking of an eye or some muscle movement, which could be, coincidental or, may not directly reveal consciousness. So if there is a way to look at the brain, look what was going on inside the brain and sort of directly measure consciousness, this could actually be of tremendous benefit to patients that have had some kind of brain damage or, are basically in a terrible state, but may yet be helped by modern medicine in one way or another. So that part was interesting. And then, of course, having said that, I feel like everything we talk about gets us back to the famous hard problem, because, how do you measure consciousness? That's kind of the $64,000 question here is, at what point can you say, yes, I, as a third party, have measured your consciousness?
I totally agree. And it's hard to get away from the sort of nagging, hard problem. But I think if you can put it aside, this is a fascinating book. I had really high hopes for this book because I love Dehaene's earlier book, Reading in the Brain. That one looked at how the brain is able to read when reading is such a recent invention in evolutionary history. And that was completely fascinating. So I think that one was a little bit better, but I think this is a really interesting book. It's written at sort of the perfect level. He doesn't speak down to the reader, which is a real pet peeve of mine in science writing. And he covers a lot of ground in a really accessible way. So I highly recommend it.
And I recommend it too. I mean, it's not perfect. I'm not sure that any book on consciousness is going to satisfy everyone. And of course, there are so many other books that the reader can turn to. As I mentioned before, we have books by Daniel Dennett, Steven Pinker, Antonio Damasio, Roger Penrose, for people who want to go a little further into the physics side of things. But Dehaene has given us a fascinating look at some of the experiments being done in the laboratory today to try to shed some light on how conscious perception works, and it's quite an accomplishment. The title, again, is Consciousness and the Brain, Deciphering How the Brain Codes Our Thoughts, and the author is Stanislas Dehaene. Coming up next, On the Nightstand.
So, Dan, what's on your nightstand?
Well, a physics book from last year that I found quite interesting is Time Reborn by Lee Smolin. Lee Smolin is a physicist at the Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics in Waterloo, Ontario, and he's written a couple of books previously. This time he is turning his attention to the problem of time, and in particular what modern physics fails to tell us about time. And it's kind of interesting because we've been exploring time, well, really since the ancient Greeks or further, but especially in the last 400 years since Galileo and Newton, and so you'd think we'd have something pretty significant to say about time, but Lee Smolin sees it differently. He says that with Newton we have finally mathematical laws to explain how objects move and how everything behaves against this backdrop of space and time, but the problem is that the mathematical laws are sort of timeless and eternal. So for Smolin, this is a problem. He says, by virtue of being timeless, the laws basically give short shrift to time itself. And just to quote Lee Smolin for a moment, the laws ignore, quote, the seemingly most essential aspect of our existence in the world, its presentation to us as a succession of present moments. So, in other words, we have theories of physics which explain various aspects of space and time, but they don't give us an account of why time seems to flow.
So time in Einstein's theory is considered relative, right? It's time flows differently for different observers. And so is Smolin saying that time is he disagreeing with Einstein?
So, of course, Einstein's theory of relativity from just over 100 years ago was the next sort of big leap forward in our understanding of time. And some listeners will know that in Einstein's theory, there's no there's not supposed to be any sort of preferred reference frame. So, as you say, time becomes relative. So does space, in fact. So it's a very bold new way of looking at space and time. So Smolin says that there is, in fact, a preferred reference frame linked to the evolution of the universe as a whole. He calls this preferred global time. Now, that sounds pretty radical. It sounds like he's trying to overturn relativity. He says, well, no, he's not overturning relativity, but he does make this assertion that there's a single rate at which time flows, and that rate is the same throughout the universe. He says it's a reformulation of Einstein's theory, but it comes, he argues, with a big payoff, and that is that time has been rediscovered. So if you believe his argument, it's a whole new way of looking at time. And I can't say, if he's right or wrong. I guess the joke would be time will tell. But he is deeply influenced by the British physicist Julian Barbour, and perhaps a few listeners have read his book from a few years ago called The End of Time, which is also a very provocative book saying that time is an illusion. Now, Lee Smolin is not saying that time is an illusion. It's actually kind of the opposite. He's saying that time is very real, and we owe it to ourselves to go back to the drawing board, improve our theories of physics until we've come up with a theory that can actually explain this feature, this flow of time.
It's a fascinating issue. And actually, one of Smolin's earlier books, Three Roads to Quantum Gravity, is one of my all-time favorite physics books. It's he has this way of writing where it's so, what he's saying is so profound, but he says it in this very sort of simple way that you almost could easily miss that he's saying something really deep and mind-blowing.
I admire that in any science writer who's able to pull that off. And you mentioned Three Roads to Quantum Gravity. I'll just mention another one of his earlier books, The Life of the Cosmos. A really good book, really provocative. Is it better than Time? Yeah, maybe it's a bit. I found it a little more, that I got a bit more out of it than with Time Reborn. But even so, for people who are interested in the physics of time and are willing to listen to an idea that's a little provocative, just a little off the established mainstream of physics, but with some very interesting ideas. The book is called Time Reborn by Lee Smolin. Amanda, what's on your nightstand?
On my nightstand is a book from 2012 called The Idea Factory, Bell Labs and the Great Age of American Innovation. It's by John Gertner. And the book is the history of Bell Labs. Bell Labs, of course, being the research arm of AT&T. And the book covers Bell Labs from the 1920s to the 1980s. Now, Bell Labs is often hailed as sort of the premier model of an organization built to foster innovation, right?
This is kind of like the equivalent of Google today, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think Google is probably very inspired by Bell Labs. And, they were highly invested in basic science. Their researchers were encouraged to sort of go off and do their own side projects. It was very open and interdisciplinary. They even designed the building to force people to sort of interact with each other as much as possible.
Well, it's so funny you mention that because we've just been talking about Lee Smolin at the Perimeter Institute. The Perimeter Institute in Waterloo was also designed, it's this very, very modern building. And again, very specifically, the architects were told, we want to nurture as much interaction as we possibly can. So you've got, some people will have seen photographs, there's actually blackboards all over the place, and there's a central atrium, and then there's odd little fireplaces and billiard tables and stuff. So that's an idea. It's become a thing, right? It's definitely caught on. Now, I will say that when I think about Bell Labs, and I don't know the history of it in any detail, but I immediately think of the discovery in the 1960s when the two astronomers, Penzias and Wilson, were fiddling around with that radio telescope and were listening to microwave radiation, and they basically by accident discovered the echo of the Big Bang. They discovered the so-called cosmic microwave background radiation.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I always thought of it that way myself, being someone who's, really into physics. But what this book made me realize is that Bell Labs was really the birthplace of modern computing. And I just never sort of put that together, the phone system and computers. But Bill Shockley, Jim Bardeen, and Walter Brattain invented the transistor at Bell Labs in 1947. And also at Bell Labs at that time, you had Claude Shannon, who was the father of information theory. So Claude Shannon was, the first person to show that all communication is in some sense interchangeable, right? So it doesn't matter if it's a phone call or a telegram or a radio, that any kind of communication can sort of be boiled down mathematically in a way that it can be interchanged with anything else. And Shannon really saw the phone system at AT&T as a giant computer. He had this quote where he said, "This is in many ways the most complex machine that man has ever attempted." So he saw it as a single entity. And Shannon came up with this general theory of information where he showed that Boolean algebra, so this binary algebra of zeros and ones, could be encoded in and manipulated by mechanical devices, mechanical switches. And so that was the whole basis of computing. So you had Shannon's theory of information processing, and you had the transistor, and voila, you could have a digital computer.
So it's interesting when I think many of us think of the history of the computer and the history of computing science. We think of Alan Turing, the great British mathematician. Actually, he's going to be on a lot of people's minds because there's a Hollywood movie that's just come out about his life just now. But we might also think of John von Neumann, based in the United States, actually based, I guess, also in New Jersey. But we might not think of Bell Labs. So what do you think? Has the author presented a compelling argument that without Bell Labs there wouldn't be an electronic computer, or its progress would have been much delayed?
Definitely, because the transistor was sort of the key. That Shannon's information theory was the key, and so then, right, you would wonder, why didn't AT&T become Microsoft or Apple or something? And the reason is really interesting. So AT&T had struck a deal with the U.S. government. They basically had a government-sanctioned monopoly on long-distance telephone service. And so in order to keep this monopoly, they had to keep giving certain concessions to the government. And so one of these concessions was that they agreed to not enter the computer or consumer electronics markets. So they explicitly made this decision not to go into computing in order to maintain their monopoly.
So that's really interesting, and of course AT&T is a large and famous company, and we think of them for their role with the telephone, obviously, but it sounds like they came really, really close to being the company that would have developed the electronic computer.
Yeah, and it's fascinating, when they finally came up with a system for having sort of automated switches for the phone service. So, you used to have these ladies standing there, plugging the different plugs in. And so once they were able to automate all of that, they were fully aware, and they're using transistors, they were fully aware that basically they had just made a giant computer, and they had to tweak the language in all of their, materials so that they wouldn't, offend the government, where they had already said that they wouldn't go into the computing business. So in some sense, they really were sort of like the first to make computers, digital computers. So that was something I never knew. And the book was just completely fascinating. The research is really impressive. And it's just this amazing look at sort of the interplay between technology, basic research, industry, and government. And it's beautifully written. It's got really colorful characters. It's really a page turner, and I just didn't want it to end. Again, the name of the book is The Idea Factory, Bell Labs, and the Great Age of American Innovation, and the author is John Gertner.
You've been listening to Episode 2 of BookLab. Look for us on iTunes and on SoundCloud. Follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/BookLabPodcast, and follow us on Twitter at BookLabPodcast. And speaking of Twitter, my own Twitter handle is Dan Falk.
And mine is Amanda Gefter.
And you can also email us at booklabhosts@gmail.com.
Bye for now. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on BookLab.